It's a Sunday evening in Manhattan, November 27th of 2005, the Sunday after Thanksgiving. The city is still full, people are visiting family, heading back from long weekends, catching the tail end of the holiday that always feels like it ends too fast. On the Upper East Side, it's a quiet night, the kind that feels safe until it doesn't. At 6:59 p.m., a 911 call comes in. The caller is a young man. He's 23 years old, and his name is David. And the first thing the dispatcher notices is how calm he sounds for what he's telling her. David tells the operator he lives in an apartment, and his roommate is on the floor, not moving, and there's blood everywhere. A lot of blood. He says he doesn't know what happened, that he went to go get his car. He was supposed to drive her to work at 7 o'clock, and when he came back, she wasn't answering her phone, she wasn't buzzing him in, so he went upstairs and he found her. When officers arrive at 355 East 86th Street at 7:07 p.m., David is in the hallway. His eyes are glassy. He tells them he doesn't think his roommate's breathing. He thinks she's dead. The officers push open the door to apartment 2D, and what they find inside would stay with them forever. It wasn't just the overwhelming metallic scent of blood or the chaos of her things scattered everywhere. It was the sight of Catherine herself, lying motionless on the floor. In a scene of such brutality, the first question that came to mind was, who did this? Hi, everyone. Well, let me take you back to that apartment in Manhattan. When officers stepped through the door of Unit 2D at 355 East 86th Street, they were not prepared for what was on the other side. The living room was undisturbed. It was quiet. There was a small chihuahua sitting on a futon. Nothing broken, nothing out of place. But at the back of the apartment, in the bedroom, that told an entirely different story. The bed had been shoved up against the doorway. It wasn't against the wall where it had belonged, but jammed at an angle across the entrance, like it was pushed there by force. The paramedics had to move it just to get inside the room. And when they did, when they finally got eyes on what was in there, it was a lot to take in. There was blood on the walls, on the floor, all over the furniture, on the sheets, on the surfaces of the room, so small you could barely turn around in it. Detective Stephen Getz, one of the most experienced investigators in Manhattan's 19th precinct, would say that he had never, in his career, been at a crime scene that violent. He said it looked like someone had thrown a bucket of red paint across every inch of that room. And Catherine was on the floor. She's 21 years old. She's in a tank top and gray sweatpants. Paramedics carefully turned her over, and that is when they saw the wound to her neck. It was catastrophic. She had also sustained multiple stab wounds across her face, her torso, her hands, and also what stood out was that her body was still warm. So whatever happened in that room had not happened very long ago. A bloody boot print pressed into the back of her tank top. Another one was on her sheets, and another on the living room floor. And critically, not a single drop of blood beyond the apartment door. So whoever did this, they had not tracked a single footprint into that hallway. They had walked out of that room clean. There was no forced entry, no broken locks, no shattered windows. It appeared as though this door had been opened from the inside, or someone had a key. And then out in the hallway, perfectly calm, stood this young man who said that he lived there. He said he found her. He said that he left to go get his car, and he was supposed to drive her to work that night, and he came back to find her like this. That young man's name was David. And as far as investigators were concerned, he had a lot of explaining to do. But you know that I'm not just going to drop you into the story just like that. You need context. Who was Catherine? That's what investigators would have to understand to make sense of how she ended up here. And since this is, pretty much an ultra deep dive, I want you to really get to know this woman because she was extraordinary. Catherine Elizabeth Woods came into this world in June of 1984, and even the circumstances around her birth had this certain flair to them. Her parents, Jonathan and Donna Woods, were actually from Columbus, Ohio, but Catherine didn't make her entrance there. She was born in Madison, Wisconsin, of all places, because her father had somewhere to be. John Woods was by that point Already somewhat of a local legend back home in Columbus, he had been appointed to one of the most prestigious positions in the world of collegiate music. He was the director of the Ohio State University Marching Band. And if you know anything about Ohio State, you would know that the marching band is not just a marching band. It is a genuine source of pride for this entire state. And John, who was also a music professor at OSU, was the man at the center of it all. And that summer, he had been invited to guest conduct a band festival at the University of Wisconsin. So him and his very pregnant wife, Donna, made the trip. And Catherine chose that moment to arrive. It's a good story. And it's the kind of family that she was born into where music wasn't just a hobby or a career, it was like the air they breathed. The Woods family settled back in Columbus in a suburb called Worthington, a comfortable tree-lined kind of place. And over the years, John and Donna's family grew. Catherine was joined by her brother Stephen and her sister Victoria. And from the very beginning, Catherine was the one you would notice first. Growing up with a father who directed one of the most celebrated marching bands in the country meant that Catherine's childhood was filled with music and performance and the energy of a crowd responding to something extraordinary. John loved to tell the story of little Catherine at marching band events, barely old enough to walk, and she's jumping around to the music. This little girl didn't just dance to it. She felt it with her whole body because it meant something to her. And she knew it early. When she was only 3 years old, Catherine sat her parents down and she announced her plans. She was going to be a dancer, a figure skater, and a horse rider, because when you're 3 years old, there's no reason to limit yourself. And Catherine was never the kind of person who did. The figure skating and the horse riding, they became hobbies, but the dancing, that was never going to be just a hobby for Catherine. Donna enrolled Catherine in lessons at a local studio called Dance Reach. It was run by a woman named Mary Rose Bushrow, and it was located just outside of Worthington. And from the beginning, Catherine threw herself in completely. Ballet, tap dancing, jazz, modern. She didn't dabble. She committed. And even among a studio full of little girls who all wanted to be dancers, something about Catherine stood out to Mary Rose almost immediately. There was this quality to the way that she moved that was difficult to actually put into words. A natural musicality, a physical intelligence of some kind, the kind of presence that made you look at her even when she wasn't doing anything spectacular. And Mary Rose had been teaching long enough to know the difference between a talented child and one who had something genuinely special. And Catherine truly had something genuinely special. But talent, as any serious performer will tell you, only gets you to the starting line. What takes you across the finish is everything else, and Catherine had that too. The discipline, the hunger, the willingness to stay after class and do it again and push herself past the point where the other kids went home. Mary Rose saw it, and she nurtured it carefully because she understood what she was looking at, a future star. And outside of dance, Catherine was, well, a bit more introverted than most kids her age, but she still forged close, lifelong friendships. One of her first and best friends was Emily Pettigrew. They met in the first grade, and by the time they were in elementary school, they had already mapped out their futures with total confidence of a child who doesn't yet know that life won't always cooperate. In their minds, Catherine was going to Broadway, and Emily was going to be an interior designer. And they were going to live in an apartment together, Catherine dancing for a living while living in an apartment designed by Emily. Big dreams. And by the time Catherine was in Worthington Kilbourne High School, dance had become everything. And she had spent a few years playing the baritone horn, and this was because she wanted to for her father. It was a nod to him. She was actually good at it. But by the 9th grade, as John himself would later recall, that was the end of baritone horn. Dance was it, full stop. She got good grades. She was focused and disciplined in the classroom the same way she was in the studio. But with every available hour outside of school, it belonged to Dance Reach. On the weekends, most evenings, any stretch of time that could be claimed, Catherine claimed it. And she spent it dancing. And by now, she had actually become something remarkable to watch. When Catherine performed, There was what her instructors and peers could only describe as a star quality about her, a sparkle. This elegance, it felt effortless, even when it wasn't. And anyone who dances seriously knows that the most technically demanding work always looks like it costs nothing when it's done at the highest level. And she was superior. In group routines, Catherine was a dancer that your eyes would follow, not because she was trying to pull your focus. It was because she just had that thing that some performers are born with. It just cannot be taught. When she was on stage, you watched her. Competitive dance is not always a kind world. The pressure, the scrutiny, the constant comparison, it breeds jealousy and insecurity in a lot of young people. And not for nothing. But Catherine, she never seemed to bring any of that energy into the room. Her focus and her drive somehow motivated the people around her, rather than intimidating them. Her fellow students wanted to do better because Catherine was doing better. Everyone wanted to be around her. And it wasn't just her striking looks, accentuated by this flowing dark hair she had, these stunning blue eyes, and a bright smile. It was actually her kindness, her big heart. She was thoughtful, and it made everyone around her want to be her friend. People frequently actually told her she looked like Angelina Jolie, and she loved that because she was one of her favorite actresses. And when you look at photographs of Catherine from this period in her life, it's not hard to see why people made the comparison. Her closest dance friends were Megan Wilkins and Katie Miller, and together the three of them built a world around dance that felt, in the way that teenage friendships at their best do, like it was their own universe. Road trips to Sandusky, Toledo, and Cleveland for competitions and conventions, performances at the Columbus Zoo and the Aquarium, and the Museum of Art, Christmas shows that filled the calendar and kept them busy and purposeful. Catherine lived for those dance conventions, especially events that were run by instructors who actually worked on Broadway. People who could see you clearly and tell you honestly where you stood. And at one of those conventions, an instructor pulled Catherine aside and asked her if she was already a professional dancer, and she was still in high school. So you can imagine what a compliment that was. When she wasn't dancing or competing, Catherine spent her downtime on other creative pursuits. She did drawing, calligraphy, creative writing, and she listened obsessively to her favorite artist, Ani DeFranco, whose music she found endlessly fascinating. She also loved animals, specifically horses and dogs, and she had 2 dogs when she was younger. She had Sarah, and then later on she got Josie. And I liked how their names were like human girls' names and not the typical Fluffy or Misty or something like that. And by her senior year, Catherine had grown into one of Dance Reach's most distinguished students, and Mary Rose recognized it in the most meaningful way she could. She made Catherine an apprentice instructor, and Catherine, who was patient and playful and endlessly kind, was amazing at it. Her younger students adored her. She had a way of making them feel capable without ever making them feel patronized. She pushed them without scaring them. She was, in every sense, the kind of mentor that a young dancer needs, someone who could see what they were able to achieve before they could even see it in themselves. The impact that she had on the people around her wasn't limited to her fellow dancers. Her younger sister, Victoria, in the 4th grade at the time, was given a school assignment to write about her hero. And Victoria wrote about Catherine, who was 17. But Catherine was worth looking up to. She was the real thing, not just a talented dancer, but a curious, creative, compassionate, and quietly fierce young woman. She had a dream that was specific and serious, and she was pursuing it with everything that she had. She just needed the right stage, and she already knew where that stage was going to be. New York City, and I don't think anyone would have expected anywhere else. Catherine had never been the kind of person who did things halfway. She didn't float the idea cautiously or ask for anyone's permission either. She just announced it. She was 17 years old, still in her senior year of high school, and she was already making arrangements. She and her best friend Megan had plans to graduate early, and Catherine had been saving money, putting it aside. She had done her research, and she had a plan. And if you're a parent, you're probably thinking what John and Donna were. No. But to their enormous credit, they did not panic. They were scared. Their daughter was so young. She had never lived anywhere away from home, and New York City was not Columbus, Ohio, not even by any stretch of the imagination. And the gap between those two worlds in the early 2000s felt vast and genuinely dangerous in ways that were hard to articulate but impossible to dismiss. How would Catherine support herself? Did she know anyone there? Was a girl from Worthington Street going to be able to navigate one of the most intense urban environments in the country? And John, who had built his entire career at Ohio State, was gently pushing Catherine to consider Ohio State's own highly regarded dance program. She could even stay close to home, develop her technique, and still pursue everything she wanted, just later on. And now stay, closer to home in a more structured timeline. Catherine heard every word of it. And then she went ahead and planned her way anyway. And she had a reason. And it was a real one. Dance is not like most careers. The body that carries a dancer through their prime years is on a clock that doesn't stop for anyone. It doesn't stop for college, not for careful planning, and not for a parent's reasonable fears. Flexibility, agility, physical peak, these things have a window. And Catherine knew that, as she told her mother with clarity that must have been both impressive, but also heartbreaking. If I don't go now, I never will. And in May of that year, 2002, Catherine found herself a room in a shared apartment in Brooklyn. She packed up her things and she moved east. She was full of excitement. Everything had fallen into place and it happened so quickly. Maybe too quickly. Because as it turned out, she had been in New York less than a week before she was calling the police. She had been sharing this apartment with a male roommate. He was 34 years old, and one night, he tried to force himself on her. Catherine reported it to the police. The man was arrested and charged. And Catherine, who was shaken to her core, went home to Columbus, to the safety of her parents. This was the nightmare that John and Donna had feared from the start. And it would have ended the New York chapter for a lot of people. For a 17-year-old girl who had barely unpacked her bags before something so unimaginably horrible had happened, going home and staying there would have been completely understandable. But Catherine wasn't wired that way. After taking the time she needed to process what happened to her, she was supported by her family through this very difficult time, and she made her decision. She was not going to let what that man did stop her from working towards her goal. She was going back. She ultimately chose not to testify against her attacker, and the charges were dropped. And I can only imagine how complicated and exhausting that decision really was. But Catherine made that decision on her terms. She wanted to look forward, and she didn't want to look back on that. And her father, who understood that nothing was going to stop her short of locking her in her room, he wasn't going to be able to keep her in Ohio. So he did the next best thing. He decided that he was going to be the one who found her apartment this time. It was on the Upper East Side of Manhattan at 147 East 85th Street. A better building, a better neighborhood, a much better situation. If his daughter was going to do this, John was going to make sure she was doing it somewhere that gave him at least a fighting chance of sleeping at night. And in case you aren't familiar with the Upper East Side, it's one of the most well-known affluent neighborhoods in the entire country, not just New York City. Old money, prestige. It's where families like the Rockefellers, the Roosevelts, and the Kennedys lived. When people picture wealthy Manhattan, this is usually what they're picturing. And by the early 2000s, it had one of the lowest crime rates in Manhattan. And in case you want to relate things to pop culture, it's the setting for Gossip Girl, Breakfast at Tiffany's, The Devil Wears Prada, and Cruel Intentions. So on 4th of July weekend in 2002, John and Donna drove their daughter back to New York and helped her settle in. Catherine packed the things that mattered the most to her, and among everything she brought was a stuffed rabbit named Hop Hop. It was an Easter gift that her parents had given her when she was just 9 months old. She had it her entire life, and she wasn't going to leave it behind. And as the skyline came into view on that drive, Catherine was every bit as excited as she had been the first time. Maybe more this time, because she knew what she was walking into. John and Donna helped her get settled in, and then they had to drive away, which was one of the hardest things a parent can do. But Catherine had promised to call them as much as she could, and she would come home to visit, and she would be okay. And she meant every word of it. The Upper East Side was more than a good base as an ambitious young dancer could ask for. It was once known as the Silk Stocking District. Only the wealthiest women could afford silk stockings, so its nickname alone tells you everything you need to know about who historically lived there. It stretched from 59th Street up to 96th, bordered by Central Park and Fifth Avenue to the west and the East River on the other side. And by the time Catherine arrived, it was home to just over 200,000 people, some of the city's finest museums, and a density of coffee shops, diners, delis, and gyms that suited her lifestyle perfectly. And for John and Donna, it was the best available option short of bringing Catherine home. For Catherine, this was her new home. New York City in the summer of 2002 was a city that was still finding its footing. The September 11th attacks had just happened 9 months earlier, and the emotional and the logistical weight of that day was still felt by everyone. It was like a cloud that hadn't fully lifted. And yet, in a way that New York always has, the city just kept going. The delis were open, the subway was running, and the auditions continued. And the millions of people who called that city home chose to stay there and to keep building their lives there. And for Catherine, this energy was everything. Life was short. She knew that now in a way she hadn't before. She had to get to work, and she threw herself into dance immediately. John and Donna generously covered her dance and voice lessons and gave her a monthly allowance of $1,000. That was no small commitment, and one that Catherine definitely didn't take for granted. She supplemented that by landing a job in a dance troupe and picking up some waitressing shifts at a local breakfast spot called Scramblers. The apartment was tiny. Her futon served as both a bed and a couch. The refrigerator was barely larger than the one in a college dorm room, and the bathroom was so small that turning around in the shower required a certain amount of strategy. But none of that bothered her. She had her own space in New York City. She was doing it, and you kind of have to be excited for her. She was just so ambitious and driven. But Catherine knew her competition in New York would be brutal. She was now a small fish in a very, very big pond. With its theatrical history dating back to 1823, Broadway today is home to over 40 professional theaters, all located near Times Square. It's the American pinnacle of commercial music theater, both in terms of revenue and performer accomplishment. There are usually 30 to 40 professional productions running at any given time, some with huge casts that run for many years. Around 800 performers are employed at any one time. And on that basis, you would think there would be plenty of opportunities, but that's not the case. The life of a performer hoping to make it big on Broadway is punishing. The audition process is ruthless. Roles are very short-term, or they're dependent upon the length of a show being run, making this line of work unpredictable. High reward, but also financially high risk. Now, Catherine did have some advantages. She was training at the Broadway Dance Center on West 57th Street, one of the most prestigious dance facilities in the country, with a roster of about 40,000 students and alumni that includes names like Jennifer Lopez and Britney Spears. Catherine took advanced ballet and jazz classes multiple times a week. Her instructors, Deborah, Kat, and Diana, noticed her almost immediately. She picked up combinations quickly, and then she would add something new to them, something personal and polished, a quality that was hers. And by the end of every week, Catherine spent at least $100 in tuition alone. But she never complained about it. She supplemented her training with regular gym sessions, and she taught dance classes to children out in Long Island, which she loved. She was pouring herself into every corner of this dream. She also became a devoted reader of Backstage magazine, which in the industry was the Bible for working performers. She combed through it every week for audition listings, and she went to every single one that she could. Open casting calls for Broadway productions could draw hundreds of dancers, and all of them were talented. All of them were hungry. Competing for a handful of spots, Catherine would stand in those lines and watch the level of competition, and she would feel the full force of what she was up against. Some days, she left those rooms feeling energized, electric, like it was only a matter of time, like the right role was right around the corner. And she almost made the cut for a musical called Sweet Charity, which gave her a sense of how close she was getting. But then, there were other days where she walked home feeling defeated. The deflation of having given everything and still being cut. That is emotional whiplash, and it is relentless. But Catherine never let it stop her. Tomorrow was another day. She would be known to generously tip her cab drivers. She would stop to acknowledge someone who might not have a home that was walking on the same streets as her. She was the person in the room that would remember everyone's name. That was Catherine, bringing the Midwest to the Big Apple. Now, it was about a month into her new life in the city that Catherine made a quick trip back home to Columbus. And one evening, she was out with her best friend Megan and Megan's boyfriend and a group of friends, and they were hanging around in this parking lot of a pool hall called the Quarter Flash. And then this guy approached the group. He knew Megan's boyfriend, and he was 20 years old, and he was laid back with this big smile and a stack of CDs that he said he recorded himself under the name City 270. He was an aspiring rapper, and his name was David Hahn. Think Eminem, even the blonde hair, the blue eyes, the vibe, all of it. The moment David was in Catherine's orbit, he could not stop staring. And it wasn't just because of how she looked, though she was striking. Any room she walked into, people would stare. But it was actually the way that she carried herself, the way that she talked. She was down to earth and warm and genuinely interested in whoever was speaking. For a girl who was actively trying to make it big as a performer in New York City, she had this ability to make other people feel like the most interesting person in the room. And David felt that immediately. And Catherine felt something between them. There was this gentleness to David, even if his exterior was a little rough around the edges. They talked and they kept talking. And by the time the evening ended, something had started between them that wasn't going to stop easily. It could have surprised most people who knew Catherine because they were complete opposites. David's background couldn't have been more different from Catherine's. He hadn't grown up in a comfortable suburb with two parents who came to every recital, paid for every dance lesson. He'd grown up in foster care, moving between homes in Columbus after his mother was convicted of drug and child endangerment offenses. The stability and warmth that Catherine always had and was given were things that David had spent his whole life without. He wasn't confident or worldly. He hadn't gone to college. He was trying to build something out of his music career. And the path wasn't easy, and the resources were pretty much non-existent. But what he had was grit and genuineness. And Catherine recognized that and responded to it. He didn't seem to be playing a role. He wasn't performing. And Catherine, who was surrounded by performers in New York City, David stood out. He wasn't trying to be something he's not. And the couple got closer in the way that long-distance relationships do. They talked on the phone late into the night. David even made the 8.5-hour drive from Columbus to Manhattan to spend weekends with her whenever he could. He was committed. And soon, Catherine had some exciting news for her friends and family. David was moving to New York City, and he was moving in with her to pursue his rap career. And I know what you might be thinking. They're young, so keep that in mind. And to be fair, Catherine's best friend Megan, she was thrilled for her. She had seen it for herself how in love they were, and all Catherine's friends liked David a lot. And in September of 2002, it was David's turn to pack up his entire life in Ohio and move to New York City to be with Catherine. But he had dreams of his own. Catherine understood that better than most, what it meant to chase something difficult. And she believed in him. The couple had a trusting and emotionally safe relationship where they could tell each other anything without the fear of judgment or rejection. She was glad to have someone familiar chasing dreams with her, and David was grateful. Catherine was the most inspiring person he had ever met. They jogged together around Central Park. They got to know their neighbors. They even became regulars at Gracie's Corner Diner, where the manager, Antonio, got to know Catherine and David so much, to know their orders by heart. Hers was a spinach and egg white omelet. Every time, David and Catherine were building something. It wasn't something big. It was something good and ordinary, which is what most people want. Catherine also got another roommate, Josie, a small black and white chihuahua. And David, he took a series of retail jobs. None of them were particularly stable. He was just trying to get his music career off the ground. And Catherine continued to grind at auditions and classes, teaching and waitressing, fueled by the $1,000 allowance she got from her parents and the force of her own determination. When her friend Katie from Dance Reach came to visit her in the summer of 2003, Catherine was so happy, telling her about working with a smaller contemporary dance company and performing as a backup dancer for an up-and-coming hip-hop artist. She was in it. She was doing it. It wasn't Broadway yet, but she was on the path. And through all of it, she had David by her side. But time and circumstances have a way of shifting things that start out good and simple. And as the years went on, the financial imbalance of their arrangement became complicated. David was struggling to find work, and the bills didn't stop. Catherine, who was working constantly between her dance commitments, teaching, and waitressing, she found herself carrying more than her share of the weight. She had her parents' support, of course, but that was for her own training and expenses, not for two people, and not indefinitely. A romantic relationship with an imbalance that only goes in one direction has a hard time sustaining itself, no matter how genuine the feelings are underneath it. And by the time the two of them had been in New York for a couple of years, the romance had shifted. It happened gradually, not dramatically, not all at once, not in a single defining moment, but as a slow renegotiation of what they were to each other. Catherine cared about David. She loved David, and she always would. But she couldn't keep supporting both of them, and the relationship just couldn't continue as it was. So they ended things, officially at least. And why I say it that way is because David had nowhere to go. And by that time, they had actually moved. Back in February of 2005, they had moved to a new apartment 2D at 355 East 86th Street, just a block north of their last apartment. It was still very much the Upper East Side, still in the heart of everything. It just didn't have a doorman. It had 4 floors, and it was a walk-up. But it worked. They got friendly with the couple next door in apartment 2J, Brad and his girlfriend Julia, and they still went to the same restaurants where they were regulars. David didn't have family in the city. He didn't have much of a financial cushion, and Catherine knew what life was like without a stable place to land. She could not bring herself to ask him to leave. Not yet. So David stayed. First, he was still sleeping in her bed like he had done before, but then eventually he moved himself out to the futon in the living room, out of the primary bedroom, and let Catherine keep it to herself. This was a clear acknowledgement of the shift between them. It was an unusual arrangement by most standards, but it was very much Catherine. She always made room for the people she loved, even when the shape of that love had changed. And by the summer, it truly had. At this point, David did have a doorman job. He was working nights at a building a block away on East 87th Street. It was steady, reliable work. It gave him the income that he could count on. And he also started dog sitting and dog walking for residents of the building where he worked. It was a small side business that kept him busy and brought in a little extra cash. He was doing better. He was finding his footing. But everyone knew things had changed. They weren't hiding it. Catherine even told the manager of Gracie's one morning when she was picking up her usual breakfast. She always had to have her usual, including her coffee, which her friend Megan joked was Catherine's one drug. I can definitely relate to that. But Catherine said that she and David had ended things, but they were still close. They were still friends, and they were still like family. And that Thanksgiving, the last one that Catherine would ever have, she and David spent the entire day together. Just the two of them. David had taken on the responsibility of cooking. Despite the kitchen being so small that only one person could fit inside, Catherine kept poking her head in, checking on things, which was driving him crazy. And after dinner, they went to the movies and they saw Rent. It was the film adaptation of the iconic Broadway musical. It had just opened that week. And of course, Catherine wanted to see it. Afterward, they came home, they settled down, and the day ended quietly. It was, by all accounts, a beautiful, ordinary day. The Sunday after, Catherine had plans to go to work, and David was going to drive her like he always did on Sunday nights. It was their routine. There was nothing unusual about it. There was no reason to think anything would be different. So now I have brought you full circle. We are back to that fateful Sunday that we started with. The Sunday after Thanksgiving. The holiday itself is over. The week ahead hasn't started yet. In New York City, the streets were quieter than usual, though. A lot of people are still out of town. They're recovering from the 4 days of family, food, travel, and the city had this particular quiet quality about it on Sunday mornings, which is rare enough that people who live there tend to notice it and appreciate it. For Catherine, that day started out as a good day. She had made plans to meet her friend and coworker, Christina DuPont, for breakfast before the two of them headed downtown together. Catherine and Christina had been spending a lot more time together because they bonded by work, of course, but by another shared interest as well, faith and spirituality. Something Catherine had been quietly exploring over the past few weeks, carving out a corner in her life that had nothing to do with auditions or choreography or pressure of trying to make it. She had instead been attending weekly meditation sessions since early November at the Creative Light Church in the East Village, and she looked forward to it every week. It was a different kind of community from the one that she built around dance. It was slower. It was reflective. And Catherine, who had always been genuinely curious about people and ideas, she took to it immediately. And that morning, the two friends made their way downtown and settled into a 2-hour service together. The meditation guide, Shirley, was so glad to see Catherine walk through the door. In the weeks that Catherine had started coming there, she had made quite the impression on everyone in that room. She was open, she was present, she was warm, and that morning, Catherine seemed completely at ease. She was happy, not a care in the world. And when the service wrapped up around 1 p.m., Catherine and Christina said their goodbyes and they went their separate ways. Catherine headed back uptown to her apartment. And that afternoon, David was home. He was taking care of a black Labrador that he was dog sitting for the holiday weekend. It was a big, energetic dog who needed a lot of attention and a lot of walks and had a bad habit of getting into things. And Catherine was spending that day doing her chores and preparing for work that evening. It was just a nice little break after a busy week. She had a lot to look forward to. Christmas was coming up, and she was anticipating a trip back home to Ohio to see her friends and family. And there was something else. Something that had given her a real lift going into the holiday weekend. She had recently called her parents with exciting news. She told them that she had been given the opportunity to step in the lead role of an off-Broadway production called Privilege, filling in for an actress that she was understudying after the woman had come down with laryngitis. For Catherine, who had been grinding through auditions and classes and that emotional back and forth of almost but not quite yet 4 years, it was a glimpse of what was possible, a taste of what she had been working towards all along. And the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, she had been in a class at the Broadway Dance Center when her instructor, Diana, pulled her aside. This was a woman with over 4 decades of Broadway experience who worked directly and closely with the legendary Bob Fosse himself. She pulled Catherine aside. Diana looked at her, and she told her something that Catherine would carry into that final weekend. She said if Bob Fosse were still alive and Catherine ever auditioned for him, he would hire her. And coming from Diana, who had been in the same room with Fosse, who had watched him work and who absorbed his standards and his vision firsthand, that was not a throwaway compliment. That was the highest possible praise that Catherine could ever receive outside of actually landing a Broadway role. And with more auditions on the horizon, who knew? Maybe that was closer than it had ever been. And Catherine was upbeat. She was hopeful. She was, by every account, from the people who had spoken to her in the days leading up to that Sunday, in one of the best places she had been in a long time. She even talked to her best friend, Megan. She called her around 5:40 p.m. on Sunday, and the two of them talked the way they always did. They caught up on everything. Catherine told Megan about Thanksgiving. That's how we know about the meal, David cooking, her eating so much, in that tiny kitchen. We know that from Megan and what they talked about. She talked about the movie they went to afterwards, which of course Catherine had so many opinions on. And she told Megan about the morning she had with Christina, the church service, how much she'd been enjoying those meditation sessions. She even said that things between her and David felt easier lately, that the awkwardness of that transition from their relationship to more of a solid friendship seemed to finally be settling in. And it was more comfortable. She was looking forward to Christmas. She was looking forward to coming home. It was a completely ordinary phone call between two lifelong friends on a Sunday afternoon. Catherine sounded like she always did, fully and completely herself. The call lasted just over 20 minutes, ending at 6:03 p.m. And after she hung up, Catherine moved around the apartment getting ready for work. She put on a tank top and a pair of sweatpants, just something comfortable for the journey there, since she'd changed into her work clothes when she arrived. That was her routine that she knew very well. She and David had a system. He would go get his car. She would finish getting ready, and she would meet him downstairs on the corner of 86th Street and 1st Avenue. Her call time was 7 p.m., and the drive was only about 10 minutes on a Sunday night with the traffic the way that it usually was. There was plenty of time. But for Catherine, sadly, there wasn't. Because in less than an hour, she would be dead. When she was found in her room, it looked like someone had ransacked it, thrown things everywhere. And there was Catherine, lying on her right side in a pool of blood. She was dressed in the outfit that she had put on earlier, and her tattoo of the word love on the small of her back was exposed. At 6:59 p.m., David called 911. The operator asked him if he knew how to perform CPR, and David said he had no idea, and Catherine was unresponsive. He pulled on the back of her top, pleading with her to wake up, but she didn't move. And I have a portion of this 911 call that I will play for you.
Baby girl, Catherine. Catherine, baby girl. Oh my goodness, I don't know what happened.
Is she there?
Yeah, there's blood everywhere. I don't even know if she's alive. I'm scared to look at her.
As David waited for emergency responders to arrive, he knocked on his neighbor Brad's door. David broke down as he told Brad's girlfriend Julia that Catherine wasn't breathing and that there was blood everywhere. Julia went with David back into 2D, and then when she encountered the horrific scene in the bedroom, she ran to get Brad. And by now, other neighbors wondered what was going on. The black lab had gotten out, and Josie chased it downstairs to the mailroom. And while on his way upstairs, after getting the dogs back, David saw 4 paramedics and 2 NYPD officers at the front door of the building. David told them that he didn't think Catherine was breathing, that he thought she was dead. It was now 7:07 p.m. Inside that apartment, the police and the paramedics took over this scene. A bloody boot print was on the living room floor, and when paramedics pushed the bed up on its side so it was leaning against the wall, a guitar was visible on the floor a couple feet away from Catherine. The neck of that instrument had been smashed, the strings were broken, and it was spattered with blood like the rest of the room. That's also when they noticed Catherine had a bloody boot print on the back of her tank top. The paramedics carefully turned her over and got her face up, and the front of her shirt was soaked in blood. And most of that blood was coming from the laceration to her neck. It was so severe that she was almost decapitated. And after the officers saw Catherine covered in blood on her bedroom floor, they stepped back out into the hallway. And they're looking at this young man standing there. And they saw someone who didn't look like they expected. David was standing there. His demeanor for someone who just found a person dead, someone that they care about, it was either gentle or guarded. He wasn't hysterical. He wasn't falling apart. But he had just told them his roommate was dead. And he's just standing there perfectly still, answering questions. And that calmness would follow David everywhere for the next several hours. And in the world of homicide investigations, calmness at the wrong moment tends to get noticed. Detective Stephen Getz arrives at the scene and he takes over. Now, Getz was one of the most experienced investigators at Manhattan's 19th precinct, the kind of detective who has seen enough crime scenes in his career to have developed a finely calibrated sense for when something doesn't add up. He took one look at that bedroom, and he knew immediately that whatever happened in there was not random. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong. This was not a stranger who wandered off the street, because the level of violence and the sheer concentrated rage of it pointed to someone with a personal connection to Catherine. And the absence of any blood trail beyond the apartment door told Getz something else. Whoever had done this came prepared. They had thought about it. They brought extra clothes, extra shoes to make a clean getaway. Getz turns his attention right to David. He noted the young man's Adidas sneakers, fairly clean, but the bottom of his baggy jeans had spots of blood on them, which David said came from when he climbed over the bed to try to reach Catherine. His body showed no signs of injury, no scratches, no defensive wounds, and nothing that suggested he had been in a struggle. So Getz asked David if there was anyone he could think of that would want to harm Catherine. And he drew a blank at first. He could not think of anyone. Catherine didn't have enemies. She wasn't that kind of person. But there was something else on Getz's mind before they even get to all that. Because the math of David's evening wasn't sitting right. And before David was even taken downtown to the 19th precinct for a formal interview, Getz wanted to establish the basics of his story. And David told him. He left the apartment to get his car around 6:40 p.m. It was his 1987 Oldsmobile, which was parked around the corner on 87th Street. He admitted he did not lock the door behind him because Catherine was still inside, so he felt like there was no need. Plus, he was going to be right back and she'd be downstairs waiting, or so he thought. He said he was gone about 20 minutes. But why did it take him so long? David explained. He said when he went and got the car, he headed back around the block, and that's when he called Catherine's cell phone so she could come meet him downstairs. He said he called Catherine twice on the way back and got no answer. He buzzed the apartment, got no answer there either, and then came upstairs to find her. Simple enough. Except that the neighbors had already started to talk, and what the neighbors were saying didn't line up with 20 minutes. This was just a brief rundown. Don't worry, I'm going to get into every single detail. But while David was being escorted down to the police station, the work of understanding what had happened inside apartment 2D was just beginning. At 8:50 p.m., Detective John Entman entered to take over processing the crime scene, and what awaited him was one of the most violent scenes that investigators at their precinct had ever documented. He was armed with his camera, his training, and the kind of methodical patience that crime scene work demands. Entman began the slow and careful work of letting the apartment tell its story. He started taking pictures. Over the course of the time he was in that apartment, he would take over 100 photos. Every surface, every angle, every detail that could be captured and preserved before anything was moved or touched. Because crime scenes are like conversations that you only get to have once. In the kitchen, something caught his attention immediately. On the wall, there was a calendar, and someone had written a note for that day, Sunday, November 27th. It read, 10:45 a.m. service, 324 Lafayette Street, 7th floor, Yoga Center. It was Catherine's handwriting, her morning, planned out, on a calendar she would never look at again. It's heartbreaking. It's a detail that makes even an investigator get emotional when he's doing his job. And then in the bedroom, Detective Entman documented everything: the blood on the walls, the blood on the floor, the blood spattered across surfaces of that room that you could barely see. On the bookcase near the doorway, there was a bloody handprint, palm and fingers pressed into the wood at roughly chest height, the kind of print left by someone reaching out to steady themselves as they fell. So was that Catherine's last physical contact with her room? In Catherine's left hand, which had been curled loosely during the autopsy preparations, investigators noted she was clutching something: short, light colored hairs. Not hers, because Catherine's hair was long and dark. These were somebody else's hairs. And additional hairs were found on her thighs and on her stomach. Animal hairs, consistent with the dogs in the apartment. Those were found on her left side and on the guitar lying near her body. Everything was documented and photographed. Everything. Then Detective Entman turned his attention to the bed. The paramedics had propped it against the wall to create space when they first arrived, which meant it was no longer in the position it had been in when Catherine had been found. So Entman carefully moved it back down to the floor, and what he found on that bedroom wall, approximately 4 feet from the ground, was a blood transfer pattern, a smear. Someone or something had brushed up against that wall before the mattress had been shoved in front of it, concealing the mark. The smear was roughly the shape of a left hand and fingertips pressing against that surface. So Entman photographed it carefully from multiple angles, and then he did something that would prove to be one of the most consequential decisions of this entire investigation. He had that section of the drywall cut out, the whole panel carefully removed and sent to the crime lab for processing. Along with it went the section of living room floor bearing the boot print. He also fingerprinted the apartment. This was painstaking work on surfaces that weren't always cooperative. And in the end, only one latent print was recovered. It was on the guitar lying next to Catherine. That print was logged and it was sent off for processing. Now, from the kitchen sink, Entombment collected a serrated stainless steel knife with a blade just over 4 inches long. Now, that would also be sent to lab for comparisons against Catherine's wounds. The apartment had given them a great deal. But the most important thing it told them, the thing that Detective Getz had understood from the moment he walked through that door, was the absence of something. There was no blood in that hallway, not a single drop beyond the threshold of apartment 2D. So, as I told you, whoever walked in that bedroom, they walked out of it without tracing a single footprint into that building's hallway. At the 19th precinct, Detective Thomas Ryan took over interviewing David. And I have to say, Ryan went in hard from the start because that was his job. And because everything about this situation put David squarely in frame. He was the last person to see Catherine alive. He was the one who found her body. He lived there. He had a key. He had a history with the victim, a romantic history that had ended messily and financially not long before this. And his explanation for his whereabouts during the window when Catherine was killed amounted to, I went to get my car and then I found her. David couldn't believe what was happening. He kept saying it. He said, "You have the wrong person. I would never hurt her. I loved her." But detectives had heard that so many times before. So they kept pushing. They wanted him to walk them through everything. How did you meet? What was your relationship like? And then the whole day on November 27th. So David started at the beginning. He told them everything I already mentioned about how him and Catherine met, how in love they were, how eventually things got hard, but they were still living together and they were still intimate and they still loved one another. David talked for hours. He waived his right to an attorney. He didn't invoke his right to remain silent. And he answered every single question they put in front of him with a kind of cooperation that could mean one of two things. Either he has absolutely nothing to hide, or he's very good at appearing that way. And now for his version of what happened the day he found Catherine dead on the floor of her bedroom. He told them that he had finished his doorman shift at the building on East 87th Street at 7 a.m. that morning. After his shift, he went and sat in his car for about 45 minutes listening to a CD that a friend made him. He was writing rap lyrics as he listened. And around 7:45 a.m., he walks back to the apartment. Now he's trying to be quiet, he says, because he knew that Catherine would still be asleep. But the dogs heard him come in, like they always did, and their excitement woke her up. She told him she was hungry for an apple specifically, but there were no apples in the apartment. So, according to David, he offered to go get one while he took the dogs for their walk. He went to the supermarket around the block, bought her an apple, brought it back, even washed it for her. And then he changed out of his work clothes and made himself something to eat. Catherine wanted to go back to sleep for a little while, so she asked him to please set her alarm for 9:20 a.m. so she could get up and meet Christina for breakfast. David said he fell asleep on the futon. He said he woke up around 4:20 p.m. Catherine wasn't home, and he didn't know where she had gone because she hadn't mentioned any plans beyond the morning. He watched some ESPN, he got up, he got ready to take the dogs out for another walk and to get something else to eat. He was still at home when Catherine called to say she was on her way back. So David said that he headed out towards 2nd Avenue to meet her, and on the way, they stopped for food. David said he picked up a frozen meal, a bag of chips for Catherine from the supermarket, and he grabbed a taco for himself. Back at the apartment, David heated up Catherine's dinner while she got ready for work. He ate his taco, they watched TV. He said he played around on his beat machine. And according to him, Catherine was just walking around getting ready like she always did. And at some point, one thing led to another, and they became intimate before she continued getting ready. Catherine said she wished she didn't have to go to work so she could spend more time with him. But it was almost time to leave. David told her he's going to go get the car and meet her outside. He doesn't lock the door because Catherine is still inside the apartment. On the way to his car, which was parked on 87th Street, David said he stopped at the building he works at. He had left a Beastie Boys CD there and he wanted to grab it. While he was there, he runs into a coworker, Abdul, and the building superintendent, Joseph. And the three of them get into a conversation about the holidays because both David and Abdul wanted time off, but they couldn't both be off at the same time. So Joseph encouraged them to work through the holidays. He said the tips were worth it, and they agreed to figure it out later. David estimated the whole conversation lasted about 5 minutes tops. Then he went and got the car, put the Beastie Boys CD in, and drove back to pick up Catherine. He calls her cell. She doesn't answer. He calls again. Nothing. He parked the car. He went to the intercom. He buzzed the apartment. Silence. He went back to his car to get his keys so he could go upstairs and check on her. And that's when his neighbor Brad stopped him outside. Brad had been out walking his dogs when he spotted something strange. The black Labrador that David was dog sitting was running loose down First Avenue on his own. Brad had caught him. He brought him back to the building, and David was completely confused. How had the dog gotten out of the building if Catherine was home? So the two men walk upstairs together. And on the second floor, David finds the lab again, loose out in the hallway outside of apartment 2D. The door was closed, but it was unlocked, exactly as David had left it. Brad goes to his apartment. David puts the dog back inside. The living room's quiet. Nothing is disturbed. Little Josie is on the futon. Nothing out of place. David says he moves toward the back of the apartment, calling Catherine's name, and that's when he saw the bed shoved against the bedroom doorway at a strange angle. It was blocking the entrance. And then he looked into the room. He didn't even finish the sentence while he's explaining this because he tried to describe it to detectives, and all he could say was, "It was a bad scene. Blood everywhere. It was bad." I think that was pretty thorough, right? Well, maybe, but detectives started pulling at the threads. Because here's the problem. David said he was gone about 20 minutes. But when law enforcement spoke to Abdul and Joseph, the coworkers from the building that David worked at, they told a different story. According to them, David had arrived at the building around 6:20 p.m. He stayed to talk to them for about 10 minutes. That meant he would have had to leave his apartment closer to 6:10 or earlier, not 6:40, as David initially said. And that meant he had been away from the apartment for closer to 35 minutes, not 20. 5 minutes is enough to kill someone. 35 minutes is more than enough time to kill someone, clean yourself up, dispose of evidence, and come back looking like you just went to get your car. And then there were the neighbors that I mentioned. Catherine's next door neighbors in apartment 2H, Jesse and Amy. They told police they were watching TV that evening when they heard what sounded like a child screaming, somewhere between 5:45 and about 6 p.m. They muted the TV. They heard what sounded like furniture being moved around, followed by dogs barking. Catherine and David were always quiet neighbors, so the noise was jarring enough to register. But the screaming stopped quickly, and Jesse and Amy just go back to their show. They didn't call anyone, they don't knock on the door, they don't check. But the problem with their account, and investigators noted this, was Catherine was on the phone with Megan until 6:03 p.m. They could get those phone records and confirm it, which meant either Jesse and Amy had the timing wrong or something else was going on at the same time in that building that didn't involve Catherine. And then there was Andrew Gold. He lived directly above Catherine in apartment 3D, and he gave investigators a more precise account. Andrew had been on the phone with his fiancée, Donna. At 6:25, while they're on that call, they both hear a scream from somewhere below in the building. Now, it was loud enough that his fiancée on the phone heard it. And Andrew could tell it was coming from Catherine's apartment. He heard scuffling, he heard screaming, he heard more movement, as though someone was being chased around in a circle. Josie was barking, and then a loud thud, like something heavy being knocked over just downstairs. Andrew ended the call at 6:40 p.m. and went out to the hallway. to see what was going on. He looks out the window, too, onto 86th Street, and there's nothing there. So he leans over the banister. He calls out, "Is anyone there?" And there was just silence. He goes back inside, he gets his things, and he leaves the building to meet a friend. Now, I know what you're probably thinking because later on, there are a lot of people who wonder why nobody did anything. But I can't dwell on that too long. Everyone has their own reasons. Some people don't want to bother the police if it's nothing. Some people are embarrassed to get involved in maybe a domestic dispute. There could be many reasons. But in this case, neither one of these neighbors thought anything drastic was going on. It started and stopped within just minutes, according to them. Now, his phone records also confirmed his call with his fiancee began at 6:18 p.m. If Andrew heard a scuffle at 6:25 p.m., if that was the sound of Catherine truly fighting for her life, then David's original claim that he didn't leave until 6:40 puts him inside the apartment when it started. Both neighbors had heard screams, that's consistent, and the proximity seemed to be more accurate from Andrew's apartment. He was sure it was Catherine's. He even knew what Josie's bark sounded like. Detectives also noted something else about David's demeanor throughout the hours of questioning. He wasn't crying, but he did cooperate with everything. He provided his fingerprints, his DNA, nail scrapings, clothing. He consented to a strip search. He agreed to have his car searched, and he sat through all of it without shedding a tear. And when a detective asked him directly why he wasn't crying over someone that he claimed to love, David simply looked at them and said he didn't know. That was his answer. I don't know. He couldn't explain it. He just didn't know. Some could call it shock. Some could call it grief. But could David be capable of this? Getz thought about it. David was young. He was naive. He was a Midwestern kid who had followed the girl that he loved to the big city. He scraped by for years while she outpaced him in every direction. So had resentment built into something darker? Was his devastating love for Catherine the very thing that had destroyed her? And if he had done it, if he had snapped in that apartment before going to get his car, how was he able to dispose of his bloody clothing, his shoes, so quickly? As I told you, they took his fingerprints. He gave them the clothing he was wearing. They looked at his entire body, and he didn't have any injuries. He consented to a full search of the apartment that he shared with Catherine and a search of his car. And there were no answers yet, only questions. And David was released without arrest. There just wasn't anything to hold him on. But before he walked out that door, Detective Getz asked him one more time, was there anyone at all, who might have a problem with Catherine? Anyone that she mentioned being uncomfortable around? Anyone who had given her a hard time, given her any trouble? David thought about it, and something came back to him. He said, actually, there was someone, a guy. Catherine had mentioned having some issues with some guy, someone that was making her uncomfortable. And he thought the guy's name was Paul, maybe Paul Vincent, but he wasn't sure. Getz leans forward. He's like, tell me more. And David remembered something else. He said back at the apartment, in the living room, he knows there's a CD in there that this guy, Paul, had given to Catherine at some point. And if he was remembering correctly, that CD had a picture on it, had a phone number, and that was the guy. So look there. Investigators go back to the apartment, and there it was, exactly where David said it would be. A homemade CD, a photo, a name, and a number. The name on the CD wasn't Paul Vincent. It was Paul Cortez. So who was he? Now, before they can look into that, they have to do something 500 miles away. In a house in Columbus that had been quiet all evening, 3 officers from the Columbus Division of Police walked up to the front door of the Woods family home and knocked. John and Donna didn't even need to be told that something bad had happened. They could see it in the officers' faces the moment they opened the door. That particular stillness that comes over people who have to deliver news that cannot be taken back. And the officers told them, contact the NYPD. They waited there while that call was made. And then John and Donna learned that their daughter was dead. John Woods, a man who had spent his career commanding hundreds of musicians, who had directed a band through presidential inaugural parades and bowl games and some of the most celebrated halftime performances in college football history, came undone completely. In his distress, he actually reaches out, he yanks a framed photo of Catherine off of the wall, and he threw it to the floor. Through everything that was tearing through him in that moment, one question came out of his mouth. Why was she dating that shithead guy? Referring to David. Donna was inconsolable. She had just spoken to Catherine the day before. She ended that call because she didn't have any more news to share. She thought nothing of it. And now she would give anything to have those minutes back, to have stayed on the phone just a little longer, to have said more. But there was nothing more to say right now because Catherine was gone. And the news rippled through Columbus in the hours that followed. Catherine's loved ones, her friends from high school, her fellow dancers, the community that watched her grow up and cheer her on and send her off to New York with so much hope. They were all grieving. It was the kind of loss that lands differently when the person was taken so young and they were so talented. And Catherine hadn't made it to Broadway, but she had made it into the hearts of everyone who knew her and loved her. And now someone had taken everything from her. The following morning was November 28th. Forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Greenberg performed Catherine's autopsy, and what he documented confirmed what the crime scene had already suggested. Whoever killed Catherine Woods had done so with a level of deliberate violence that went beyond what was necessary to end a life. This was not a moment of impulse that got out of hand. It was sustained and directed against a 21-year-old woman who had tried desperately to fight back. 3 wounds had been inflicted on Catherine's neck, most likely delivered from behind. 2 of them were horizontal in size wounds, one 4.5 inches long, and the other 5.5 inches long. The third was a stab wound, 1 3/4 inches in length. All 3 penetrated 2 inches deep. They severed 2 of Catherine's jugular veins and partially severed her carotid artery. The wounds had also severed her vocal cords, which meant that after her throat was cut, Catherine could not scream. She could not call out. So whatever she experienced in those final moments, she experienced in silence. But she fought back. There was no question about that. She had sustained 20 additional stab wounds across her right forearm, her right palm, her left arm, and her left wrist. The kind of injuries that happen when someone puts their hands up against a blade that's coming at them. And when they grab for it, when they refuse to stop fighting, even when fighting is costing them everything, they get injured that way. One stab wound was to her left hand, and it went through and perforated a tendon. Beyond her defensive wounds, Catherine had sustained a jagged stab to the left side of her cheek that penetrated all the way through her mouth. 2 wounds near her left ear, wounds to her torso and left shoulder, and a blunt force injury above her left eye. She also had cuts on her forehead. Dr. Greenberg reconstructed the likely scenario that happened from the physical evidence. He believed Catherine had been attacked from the front first. Her defensive wounds told that story. Her attacker had pushed her back into the bedroom, shoving the bed against the wall in the process, cornering her in that small space with nowhere to go, and then stabbed her repeatedly from the front, incapacitating her. And then he moved behind her, and this is when the knife was used across her throat while she was still standing, and the blood soaked the front of her shirt before she fell, reaching out as she went down, leaving that handprint on the bookcase. Her killer had then placed a foot on her back, leaving a boot print on her tank top, and then they cut across her throat a second time. Her death came from blood loss. Any one of the 3 neck wounds would have been fatal on its own. Together, they were overkill. Violence that's well past the point of death. Catherine's toxicology results came back clean. She had no drugs, no alcohol, nothing in her system. Nothing that would have impaired her ability to fight back or changed what she experienced. And then There was no DNA found underneath her fingernails, meaning that despite her ferocious resistance, she had not managed to scratch her attacker. Whoever killed her probably did not have any visible marks on them, unless they cut themselves with their own weapon, which, by the way, had not been found at this point. Dr. Greenberg estimated the entire attack had probably lasted no more than 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Catherine Woods spent the last 5 minutes of her life fighting with everything she had. And she didn't win because the person who came for her had come prepared and made sure of it. That same morning, investigators had to check another task off their list: the name, Paul Cortez. The name meant nothing to investigators. Paul Cortez? It didn't even appear anywhere in the initial canvas of the building. Nobody had mentioned him. He hadn't shown up on any of the footage they pulled from a nearby garage. It showed David and Catherine walking the black lab earlier that evening. He wasn't a neighbor. He wasn't a coworker. He wasn't anyone the first responders had encountered in the hallway. He was just a name on a homemade CD sitting in a now murdered woman's living room. But David had said something that detectives couldn't let go of. He said Catherine had issues with this guy, that there was some kind of history there that hadn't been fully explained yet. And the fact that David had initially called him Paul Vincent, getting the last name wrong, confusing it with this guy's middle name, actually made the whole thing feel more credible rather than less. Because if David was manufacturing a suspect to deflect suspicion, he probably would get the name right. So there were now two detectives, the morning after Catherine had been killed, standing in front of this Paul person's apartment at 154 East 106th Street, a 7-minute drive from Catherine's. When they arrived, Paul's mother, Yvette, was there with him, consoling him. She had apparently been the one to tell him the news that Catherine had been killed, and Paul was hysterical. He was crying. He was visibly distressed. He was asking immediately whether police had caught the person responsible. He seemed like a man who had just learned that someone he cared about deeply, was gone. So what was his connection to Catherine? He's brought to the 19th precinct for a formal interview. And this is where things get interesting. Because over the next 5 hours, as detectives asked Paul about his relationship with Catherine and his whereabouts on the day she was murdered, a picture begins to emerge that was way more complicated than anything David had given them. And if you have been drifting off, if you've been busy, we all do it, maybe around the house, half listening, I want to tell you that this is when you should start to pay close attention to the details that I'm about to give you. Now is that time. First, he, like David, declined to have an attorney present. And then he drops a bombshell. Paul says he and Catherine had been in a relationship for about a year. Wait. The investigator's like, what? Yeah. First, Paul talks about who he was and then how he met Catherine. Paul was completely different from David. He's older by a couple years. He's 25. He was raised in the Bronx. He was educated as well. At age 11, he was admitted to one of New York's most elite private schools, the Buckley School, and then to Poly Prep Country Day School on an academic and artistic scholarship. He had a fine arts degree from Boston University, class of 2003, where he had performed at the Huntington Theater, and he studied abroad in London for his junior year at the Academy of Music and Dramatic Arts. Very impressive. He's now back in New York. He's signed to a casting agency called Hardin and Curtis Associates. He's chasing his own Broadway dream, the same way Catherine was chasing hers. He was a triple threat. He could sing, he could dance, he could act. He was even the frontman of a band called Monolith, and he played venues all around the city. And I'll tell you this, the people who knew Paul really well said he was thoughtful, he was spiritual, he was soft-spoken and calm, he wrote poetry, he practiced yoga. And by normal standards, he was also attractive. Women liked him. He had fans, if you will. He had the long hair, the band guy vibe. You can imagine him on a stage, his hair kind of hanging in his face, that mysterious and interesting type that plays kind of hard to get. The kind of guy that knows he's a catch, or at least he thinks he is. And there's no doubt about it. Paul had a lot going for him. To support himself while he waited for his big break, though, Paul worked as a personal trainer. First, at the New York Sports Club on 86th Street and Lexington Avenue, and later at the upscale Equinox Health Club just around the corner on East 85th Street. And he was good at his job. He knew how to read people, how to motivate them, how to make them feel good about themselves. And that is when he ran into Catherine. As I had mentioned to you, she spent a lot of time working out, making sure she was in the best shape possible to dance. Her regular gym had been the first gym that Paul mentioned. He worked at New York Sports Club. It was a 1 minute walk from where Catherine and David were living, at the apartment her dad got them on 85th Street. It was the summer of 2004 when things between her and David were still going well. And Paul said Catherine was in one of the workout rooms and she was dancing. And he noticed her. He walks over, he hands her his CD. He's got his name and his number on it. And according to Paul, she called him the very next day. And then that was the beginning of their love story. He said they were spending more and more time together at the gym, several times a week, on the phone every day, bonding over their shared passion for performance and their shared frustration at the brutal pace of trying to make it in New York. Paul said he took Catherine to see a modern dance performance at the Joyce Theater, and afterward, they walked to Washington Square Park and had their first kiss. Even his friends could tell you that their chemistry between them was something special. But you might be asking, what about David? Paul told investigators that Catherine had mentioned that she had a boyfriend that she was in the process of breaking up with, and his name was David, but he was merely her roommate. Paul said that Catherine told him that she felt really guilty about ending things because David had uprooted his entire life to come to New York for her. But Catherine told Paul that that relationship was over. She just needed time to manage the situation carefully. But by early 2005, Paul said he switched gyms. He was now working at a receptionist at Equinox Health Club, and this was on East 85th Street and Lexington Avenue. And soon, Catherine started working out there instead. And that's when he said they officially started dating. Now, this would be around the same time that she moved to her new apartment with David, the one she was still living in when she was killed. But Paul said he had visited around 50 times and stayed the night on several occasions. He said that in the months between August and November 2005, the two of them were intimate at her apartment approximately 10 times. And when asked whether Paul thought David knew about this, he said he didn't think so because Catherine kept it that way. She didn't want to hurt David any more than she already had. And she wouldn't want to flaunt a new boyfriend in front of her ex when things were so fresh, especially given their living arrangements. And then Paul said something that piqued the detective's interest, if it hadn't already been piqued. He said that he was deeply concerned about Catherine's safety, and there were a number of reasons for this. One, he said, in his words, she was a stripper. That's what he said. It was something that he was against, and it scared him because he felt like she was putting herself in danger. He said he tried to talk her out of it on multiple occasions, but every time he raised his concerns, Catherine shut the conversation down. She told him it was her decision, her money, and none of his business. But Paul said he couldn't let it go. He cared about her way too much. So one night in April of that year, 2005, his worst fears were confirmed. He said that Catherine called him from the club. She was distressed. She was barely coherent. She was asking him to please come get her. When he got there, he said that she appeared to be under the influence of something and that someone had laced her drink. It wasn't something she chose to take. He believed she had been violated as well. From what Paul could gather, he thought that Catherine had lost sight of a drink while talking to a man and then blacked out. He brought her to a hotel because she told him she didn't want to go to the hospital. She didn't want to get a test conducted and go through all of that. Even though it was such a bad situation, he thought it was going to prove to her that she needed to stop dancing. But he said she blatantly told him she wasn't going to quit, that she was so close to her savings goal. She just needed a little more time. And Paul said he understood why Catherine didn't want to go to the hospital. She certainly didn't want to involve the police. She'd been through it all before, just after she had moved to New York, and I told you that story. it would have been re traumatizing. Paul told the investigators that this worried him so much he didn't know what to do. He was desperate to keep her safe. And even if Catherine didn't seem bothered by what happened, he was. So much so, he resorted to going through her phone to find her father's phone number. Paul called John Woods. He introduced himself as Catherine's boyfriend and told him everything: the dancing, the incident at the club, the fears he had about where things were headed, and how much he loved Catherine and knew that her parents should know that he would do whatever it took to protect her, even if it cost him her trust. Catherine's father told Paul he was very grateful for his intervention and was happy he called him. When detectives asked if Catherine was aware Paul had spoken to her father, he said yes, and she did get upset, which was to be expected, and she went silent for a little while. But Paul said she came back. She always came back. And finally, David moved out of the apartment in the fall. And once he was gone, Catherine called Paul to let him know how much she loved him. Yes, things were complicated at times, especially with David not wanting to get out of the picture, but he knew how amazing Catherine was, so he couldn't blame him. Paul was also unhappy that David wasn't pulling his weight financially to help Catherine. According to Paul, Catherine told him that she worked while David spent his time going out, making music, smoking pot, and watching TV. Catherine told him that on one occasion during an argument, David had destroyed their dishes, and that David had called him back in July, yelling at him, telling him stay away from Catherine, that he was still intimate with her and Paul needed to back off. When Paul confronted Catherine, she said that was a lie, that David was just trying to come between her and Paul. He was crying throughout this interview, unlike David, and he recalled certain details of the relationship with Catherine that made him very emotional. It was the appropriate reaction. And when asked about the relationship between them in the past few months, Paul said that Catherine would pull away and then return. She would be cold and then she would be warm again. Paul claimed he kept a low profile following David's call until he and Catherine reconnected several weeks later. Paul told them that whenever Catherine was upset with him, she would act like, and I'm quoting him, a princess, and he would have to woo her back. In the 6 weeks before her murder, Paul noticed that Catherine seemed to be pulling away and she was short with him. Paul stated that when Catherine said she didn't want to talk about it, Paul checked her phone because he wanted to find out what the problem was. When Catherine found out what Paul was doing, she was angry. The trust was gone. But Paul told the detectives they were still sleeping together after she told him she needed her space, which was around October, so a month before her murder. Paul explained they would still have casual sex at his apartment, and then when asked when the last time he was inside her apartment was, he said a couple weeks ago, but he hadn't been inside her actual bedroom in months. And when asked when he saw her in person last, Paul said it was actually the day before her murder at the Equinox gym, that she had been on the elliptical machine, and even though they had no longer been officially dating, Catherine suggested they meet up soon. So detectives wanted to know if there was anyone that Paul could think of that would have a reason to hurt Catherine. He thought about it. And he said in the weeks before her murder, she told him there was a guy named Joe that had introduced himself to her at Flash Dancers. This was a club that she was working at now. Paul felt like Joe could have been stalking Catherine, but there was something else. Paul told detectives Catherine had been involved in performing in adult movies and substances, which could have put her in the middle of a shady crowd of people. And I know that was a lot. It's a lot to take in, and we still haven't even heard his play-by-play account of November 27th yet. It's almost like Catherine was living some kind of double life with the way Paul's laying it all out there. He's articulate, he's thoughtful and cooperative, and he seems to genuinely care about Catherine. Remember, I'm giving you a condensed version. This interview went on for 5 hours. So you can just imagine the detail that he went into. But now to his account of the day Catherine was last seen alive. Paul told investigators he had been trying to reach her since early that morning. At 6 a.m., he called her. He wanted to talk about getting together that day because, as he explained, the day before at the gym, they talked vaguely about meeting up. He wanted to nail down the plans. She didn't pick up at that hour, which wasn't unusual. So he left it alone and headed to work. He worked that morning at a yoga studio. He arrived around 9 a.m. At some point during the morning, he sent Catherine a text. Still nothing back. By 2:30 that afternoon, when he still hadn't heard from her, Paul called a friend. She was also a personal training client named Stephanie Bucco, and they made plans to spend some time that afternoon together. He had a training session with Stephanie on Sundays, and they sometimes hung out afterwards as friends. The two of them had a low key afternoon together that day. First, they went to PC Richard. It's an electronics store in New York where Stephanie was looking for a humidifier. And then to the food emporium to pick up some groceries. The last stop was Barnes and Noble, where they browsed for a while before Stephanie supposedly bought Paul a book. He said it was a collection of erotic short stories, and Paul laughed about it. He said it was very Stephanie. To me, they seemed more than friends, but he continued, saying he left her apartment around 4:20 p.m. and caught the bus home. At that point, Paul said he was still trying to reach Catherine in between all of this, multiple calls throughout the afternoon that went unanswered. But he wasn't worried because he said Catherine was always busy. He knew that Sundays were her work nights where she was dancing, but he wanted to talk to her just to catch up and see if their plans could be finalized, especially since he felt like things between them had been kind of off recently. He was just checking in. Then finally he said, at around 5:30 p.m., Catherine answered. The call was brief. He said she seemed rushed and distracted, like she had somewhere to be or something on her mind. Before they could really get into anything, the call got cut off. Paul said it was odd, so he calls back immediately. And this time, Catherine answered but told him, sorry, I'm getting ready for work. I don't have time to talk at the moment, but we can connect later. He said she seemed short with him, a little cold. Paul explained that he tried calling back a few more times after that because it was really nice to hear her voice. And he was worried about her. And he really wanted to get back to whatever normal was between them, but the calls went straight to voicemail. So he left it alone. He called a few of his personal training clients to confirm their sessions for the following morning. He got himself ready and he made plans for the evening. At 8 p.m., him and his friend Spencer Lebowitz went to a bar called the Back Page on 82nd Street and 3rd Avenue. They watched the Giants football game. Now, Paul was not a big football fan, but Spencer was. And that evening was more about hanging out with friends than the game. And after about 45 minutes, the two of them left Backpage and they headed to apartment of another friend, Rob. That's where they watched the second half of the game, and the Giants ended up losing. And Paul said he left Rob's apartment between 11:15 p.m. and 11:30 p.m. and walked home. Now, on the way, he did stop and he went to a smoke shop to buy some rolling papers. He got home, he went to bed. The next morning, he met a personal training client, Brian Sampson, and that was around 7 a.m. A little later that morning, though, his mom walks in, and that is when he found out that Catherine had been killed. Paul described that moment, and he said this was a direct quote. He said, she told me that Catherine was killed the night before, just like I just buckled. I remember just kind of sitting on the stoop right almost outside of the club, and I just couldn't believe it. I was just in complete shock. Then Paul and his mom went back to Paul's apartment together. And shortly afterward, the police showed up, which you know all about. And they brought Paul in for questioning. That was Paul's account of his entire day. And by the way, his mom was interviewed. And she did confirm that she heard about Catherine's murder on the radio. And when she saw Catherine's picture in the newspaper, she recognized her instantly as the young woman her son had been seeing. The news reports kept referencing a boyfriend being held for questioning, and Yvette was panicking. She thought that meant Paul. But it was actually David who was at the station at that time. She goes down to Paul's work to try to find him. He's there. He's going about his normal day, Monday morning shift. And she said he had no idea that any of this was happening. And that's when she had to break the news. There was just one other question they had for Paul. What shoes were you wearing last night? Because remember the bloody shoe prints? Paul said he'd been wearing the same shoes he was wearing right now, a pair of Johnson & Murphy loafers. Like David, Paul provided a DNA sample, a shoe print. He had his hands photographed. And just like David, Paul didn't have any signs of any injuries, aside from a blood blister on the edge of one of his fingers, which he said was from lifting weights. Paul provided a written statement detailing everything he just told them: his movements, his calls, his evening, and his relationship with Catherine. After this, the detectives take Paul back to his apartment. Paul gave his permission for the officers to search his things, to go through his room, his entire apartment. But they did tell Paul he had to stay in New York for the time being, even though at this stage, David looked like the more likely suspect to police. Finding out Paul had been in the mix romantically could have been a sufficient motive for David, who was still deeply in love with Catherine. Paul was everything David wasn't. He was educated, articulate, cultured. He'd apparently called Paul to tell him to stay away from Catherine. He had access to the apartment, and David's timeline was shaky. They also had more questions for him. David was once again cooperative when asked about what he knew about Paul and whether or not the two of them had ever had any confrontations. Because remember the phone call that David failed to mention? He admitted he did call Paul. But according to him, it was after Paul made an unexpected and unwanted visit to their apartment without warning. This was back in June. He wouldn't leave when Catherine told him to. It was a Sunday afternoon. Catherine and David were both home at their apartment on 86th Street when the intercom went off. Catherine answered it, and whoever was on the other end of that intercom, she knew immediately who it was. And her response was just as immediate. She told him to go away. The buzzer kept going again and again. Whoever was downstairs wasn't leaving. Catherine was trying to hold it together. She tried to keep David away from the door. She tried to manage the situation quietly and calmly without letting it spill into the other parts of her life. But David wasn't the kind of person who could stand there and watch someone make Catherine uncomfortable in her own home without doing something about it. He told her, "I'm going downstairs." Catherine tried to stop him. Catherine, who was not easily rattled, did not want David anywhere near whoever was pressing that button. But he went down anyway. David took the stairs down and walked out to 86th Street, but whoever had been buzzing was gone. He couldn't see anyone on that block. He went back upstairs, and standing inside the apartment talking to Catherine is a man that David had never seen before. He looked like he was in his mid-20s, and Catherine looks angry. Not the way you look when a casual acquaintance stops by unexpectedly. The way you look when someone you've been trying very hard to contain has just walked through the door anyway. Catherine, she turns to David and she says, "Wait, please wait in the hallway," because she needed to take care of something. David listened to her. He did as she said. He stood in the hall outside the apartment and waited. A few minutes later, the man comes out. And instead of walking right past David and heading for the stairs, he stops. He says he needs to talk to David. So David agreed. And the two of them went back outside and they're walking together towards 2nd Avenue. And this is this uncomfortable silence between these two people. Two people who already know on some level that what they're about to say is going to hurt. The man introduced himself as Paul. And he told David that he had been dating Catherine for almost a year. He said the relationship didn't seem to be going anywhere anymore, and that's why he stopped by. David just stood there to take it all in. He's like, "A year?" And while David was in the apartment every single day, walking the dogs, driving Catherine to work, sharing her home and her life in her bed, Paul is saying he's also dating her the entire year. So David asked if Paul and Catherine had slept together, and Paul said yes. And then David told Paul the same is true for him. The two men are looking at each other on that sidewalk and processing all of this. They're just standing there. And they're both saying the same thing, neither of them fully understanding what had actually been going on inside that apartment. It was confusing. David explained he wasn't the kind of person who got loud or physical, but he was hurt. He just went quiet. He took it in. He tried to make sense of it. And Paul seemed genuinely surprised to learn that David and Catherine were still living together, still sharing a home and a bed, because Catherine had apparently told Paul that David was just a roommate now. someone she felt sorry for, a moocher who couldn't support himself and didn't contribute to the bills. And that part hurt because David knew what he contributed. He knew that he and Catherine meant a lot to one another, regardless of how she may have described it to someone else. But after Paul said his piece, they parted ways on 2nd Avenue, and David went back upstairs. And when he walked in the apartment, he looked at Catherine and he told her everything Paul had told him, that they'd been dating for nearly a year, that they had been sleeping together, all of it. And Catherine didn't even miss a beat. She told David, "Do not listen to a word that man says. He is crazy." That yes, she knows him. They met at the gym, and in the beginning, yes, they occasionally grabbed food together. They were friendly. But that was it. She said she and Paul were never together, and they had never been together. And David needed to understand that Paul was not well. He was unstable. He had a way of fixating on things that weren't real and convincing himself that they were true. David looked at the woman he loved and he chose to believe her. But here's what I need you to sit with as we close out on part 1. Yes, this is part 1 of 2 parts. There are now 2 very different versions of all 3: Catherine, Paul, and David. But Catherine is dead. She can't reconcile the inconsistencies, but the evidence will. The truth will come out. Now, don't look this case up. Come back for part 2. It should be out in just a few days, not a whole week. I made sure to record these fast and get them out, but leave a little breathing room so you can watch a full episode because there is a lot. And if part 2 is already out, you're going to see it right up on the screen right here. So don't forget to click that. It will also be in the description box if it is out yet. And I do want to thank you so much for being here for Catherine's story. I will see you in part 2. Bye.